Hey friends, it's Father Brian here with our second session of our virtual Bible study. So last week for our first section, Father David led us through some of the culture and context behind Philippians, as well as what Paul says in the first chapter. So now we're into the second chapter, and I'm going to lead you through it with 3 different sections. And at the end of each section, I'll include a going further question, a chance for you to engage and think and process more as we wrestle with the words of the Apostle Paul and try to discern what he might be saying to us and our community. I'm so glad that you've joined me for this study, and I look forward to hearing about what you've learned in it. So Paul starts this chapter with kind of this bid to unity. He's calling the Christians together to be unified and hold the same things in mind. If you look at what he says in verse 2, make my joy complete, be of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. And you hear that there, keeping the same mind and the same accord, one mind. And again, further down in verse 5, he says, let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus. So there's this sense here that Paul is bidding the Philippian community to have kind of hold to the same attitude, the same ethos, to share these things in common. This is the challenge of Christian community, is how to find a sort of unity, how to come together and work out our faith in the same direction. And that's what Paul encourages the church to do in this moment. And he lays out, the qualities that would look like. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. And that echoes the words that we hear Jesus say when he's asked about, what is the greatest commandment? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and also to love your neighbor as yourself. Paul is pulling this out here, helping us to see that faithful Christian living is really about making little of ourselves and making much of our neighbors. And I love that picture because if you think about that system works really well. If everyone in the world was putting everyone else's needs above their own, then everyone would be taken care of because everyone is looking out for everyone else. And I think that's a little bit of what Paul is imagining here. And that's why it's so important for the Philippians to be of the same mind, to all kind of have the same desire to live life in that way. To be looking out for one another, to be caring for one another, to be sure that they're not puffing themselves up or making themselves too important. So that's how Paul is conceiving of unity in this way, to share this kind of attitude, to have in one mind this making little of ourselves to make much of each other. And what does that look like? How do we do that? And Paul anticipates that beginning in verse 6. And verses 6 through 11 are something that scholars often call the Christ hymn. It's not clear whether it's actually a hymn, a song, but it is a very ancient bit of poetry. This is something that Paul probably didn't write, but is borrowing a verse, kind of a song or hymn or poem that existed in the Christian communities already, something that they would have known or been familiar with. And that's so exciting because it's one of the most original things that we have in the New Testament. One of the first things that, the Christians put to page, and this image of what Jesus did and what Jesus was like. It also means that this might be one of the earliest instances in the Bible that we get a sense of Trinitarian theology, that Jesus is a member of the Trinity that includes God the Father and God the Spirit, and that this passage shows that Jesus existed at the beginning of creation, some kind of pre-existence of Jesus. And these are all big, crazy theological terms, but for biblical scholars, it's exciting to see how some of the later theology that the church expands on and kind of discovers, that we find in the creeds, that it has its roots in these really early letters that Paul was writing. And even in passages like this that probably existed before Paul wrote the letter. So I love the Christ hymn. I think this is one of the coolest parts of the New Testament, and I always just keep coming back to it. And we can kind of map it out in space. There's some movement and momentum to the Christ hymn. So it starts kind of up above, Jesus had the form of God, equality with God. But it wasn't something to be exploited. It wasn't something to use selfishly. Rather, Jesus pours out himself, lowering himself to take the form of a mortal man. So you see this movement from kind of heaven to earth with the incarnation. And we get an example of that humbling, that outpouring, making little of oneself to make much of others. And not only does Jesus humble himself by becoming obedient as a human being, the incarnation, but humbles himself to the point of death, even death on a cross. So Jesus has gone from, heaven to earth, now to death and the grave. But the story doesn't end there. We know that then God highly exalts Jesus up above all things, enthroned above all creation, and that at the name of God, every knee will bow, both those in heaven around the throne and those on earth and even those under the earth. All those spaces are wrapped up and drawn to worship this exalted Christ. And Jesus isn't exalted because of all the powerful, impressive, prideful things that he did. Jesus is exalted because he died, because he poured himself out, humbled himself out unto death. And that's the kind of model that Paul has in mind for our Christian communities. How can we be self-sacrificing? How can we sacrifice ourselves to make much of others, to give life to others, to help other people see and know the love that God has for them? It's a big ask and a big challenge. And, Jesus is the goal that we strive for, knowing that we're never going to make it on our own. But it's still the direction that we move in. And what I love about, one of the many things I love about this passage is in that last few verses, that image of, Jesus exalted in heaven. And God gives Jesus the name that is above every name. And what do you think that is? What could that name be? There's a lot of names that are ascribed to God throughout the Bible. And the most ancient one, the first one that we really encounter, is this divine name that is to never be spoken. And maybe you've heard it before as Yahweh. And frequently, it's that if you want to impress your friends at the next cocktail party you go to, it's the tetragrammaton, which is the 4 letters. So in Hebrew, they would take these 4 consonants that made up the divine name of God and just put the consonants. They wouldn't put the vowels in because you weren't supposed to say it, but that was enough that you could read it and kind of know what it is. And as Hebrew writing continued, what they would do is they would put other vowels into there. They were kind of, these aren't the actual vowels of God's divine name, but they're the vowels for the word Lord, so that we could pronounce it out loud, but we know what we're really saying. We know it's really the divine name of God. And even today, for Jewish folks, it's a name that they won't say. And sometimes, some Christians will say Yahweh, some will say YHWH, which is how we've transliterated those 4 consonants. And the truth of the matter is we don't actually know what that divine name is because we never got those original vowels. There's a lot of good guesses, a lot of good ways to say it. And even Yahweh is, it's actually German. It's a German reconstruction and transliteration. So I don't know what the divine name of God is, but I know it's probably really not Yahweh. But that's often what we'll use and what we'll say. And that's a whole lot of words to just say that when Jesus is exalted, he gets this divine name of God, this powerful name that exalts him above all creation. And at that name, of course, everyone knows that this is truly God, that this is the source of our being. And that's what leads all of creation to fall down in worship. And there's a paradox here in this passage where Jesus is, lowered and humbled, and that leads to Jesus being exalted. That leads to God's glory. And that's part of the power and the force of Christian faith, especially as Paul conceives it, is this kind of nonsensical way that the way to be lifted up is to be lowered, to make little of yourself is how you become exalted, and that much is made of you. And that was really attractive as it is today, I think, in the Greco-Roman world, to people who are already put down, people who already are down in the dumps or feel like they're at the bottom of the barrel. It's this message of hope for them, that they too will be lifted up, and that God can exalt even them. And it was a challenge to the people with power, the people who sat on top of the food chain. These were the folks who had a lot to lose. But even for them, they had so much to gain. One last thing that I'll comment on in this section of chapter 2 is this idea of imitation as a form of ethics. This was a very ancient model where the idea is to become a better person, to find good morals or to practice good ethics. The way you would do that is by imitating somebody who already did that. And that's Paul's call here, to have the same mind in you that was in Christ Jesus. In other words, imitate Jesus. Follow the things that Jesus did. And this model of imitation, I think, is a really powerful one. C.S. Lewis has a quote that I absolutely love. He says, "All mortals turn into the things that they pretend to be." And the idea with that is that the way to become a better person is to pretend that you are a better person and act as if you were a better person and do the things that a better person would do. And slowly over time, you come to find that you've actually become that better person. And it's a practical way to think about ethics, as, our ethics aren't so much grounded in the things that we do, but in the people that we are. So the way to change what we do is to change who we are and to cultivate a better model of who we want to be. And that leads into our first going further question today. Who are your role models? Who do you emulate? And you can't say Jesus because, that's too easy. That's the freebie that Paul already gave us. But think about the people in your life that you really admire or that you look up to, the people that you want to be like. And maybe they are people you know, or maybe they are people in the TV shows you watch, or the movies you really like, or in your favorite book. But try to be specific. Think about a person or two who you really treat as a role model, someone you really look up to and try to be like. I like to joke that when I was growing up, and still today, one of my favorite characters in fiction is Gandalf, the wizard from The Lord of the Rings. So I always say that he is one of my role models. I always want to be more like Gandalf. And, I don't expect to wear a cool hat or carry around a wizard staff or anything like that. But in The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf is really a supporting character. He's there to look out for all the other characters, to jump in and help them when they need it most. To always be thinking and planning ahead to do the most good for the people around him. And that way, I think there's something really Christian about that character of Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings. So take a few moments now and jot down your own thoughts. Who are some people that you want to imitate? If you can't think of anyone, who's somebody that you'd like to be more like? Who's somebody that you could emulate more, someone who could or should be a good role model for you? And we turn now to the second section of chapter 2, which is verses 12 through 18. I'm going to start by reading verses 12 and 13 right out to you. Therefore, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed me, not only in my presence, but much more now in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is at work in you, enabling you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. These verses are exciting and challenging and maybe even a little scary. What does it mean to work out our faith with fear and trembling? And it makes it sound so imposing and scary, and that we ought to always be, a little afraid of God and this immense responsibility laid upon us. And I think fear and trembling here, it captures more the archaic sense of those words, like awe and wonder. And if you think about awe, we can say that something is awesome, which is really good. Or we can say that something is awful, which is really bad. And that's a little bit of what's happening here, is when something is so great, so monumental, it's either really good or really bad. And that's what Paul is pointing to with these words, fear and trembling here. Not that we need to be afraid and, cowering under the bedsheets from faith and from God, but that this is something really big and we should be in awe of it. There should be a lot of wonder, something that kind of blows our minds and that really challenges us, not in a scary way, though maybe sometimes, but certainly challenges us in a big way. That this is something really different and really outside of our normal experiences. And this verse runs right into that good old argument that came about in the Protestant Reformation that Martin Luther was so concerned about. Are we saved by works or are we saved by faith? And the Reformed tradition, really maintains that, it's faith alone is what saves us. And sometimes it's unfairly said, it's not like the traditional Catholic Church, and certainly not the Catholic Church now, doesn't think that we work and earn our way to salvation. But the other idea is that our works are kind of examples of our faith. Our works prove the quality of our faith. So we don't do good works to earn our way to heaven. But by doing good works, we're showing that our faith is sincere. And if someone says that they have faith but don't have good works to show for it, it makes us begin to wonder how sincere that faith really is. And I think that's the direction that Paul is pushing towards here. This idea that our works should show forth our faith. And in the second section of chapter 2, that's what Paul's concerned with, is what does our public witness look like as Christians in the world? So we don't need to get caught up in that, whether we're saved by faith or works, because in chapter 13, Paul makes it clear it's God who is working in you. And God working in you enables you to will and to work for his good pleasure. So the idea is that, God is the genesis of our faith. God is, kind of plants the seed that blooms in us, that encourages and excites us to continue hoping and continue believing and continue persevering in our faith. And that means, too, that there's kind of movement towards it. There's a direction, which we've been talking about already. That our faith is not this static thing, a little checkbox that we make that says yes faith or no faith. Our faith is like a compass or a roadmap that's propelling us to follow Jesus. It's an active thing where, it takes a little bit of sweat, a little bit of work, a little bit of energy, and sometimes we might even feel exhausted. But that's a good feeling because it tells us that we truly are being faithful, that we truly are following Jesus in that really dynamic sense of the word. Something else that I love about these two verses here is when Paul says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. This is a moment where Texas has something really wonderful to offer biblical scholarship. And that's with the word y'all. Because our good old NRSV translation adheres to its proper English grammatical constructions. But what Paul really says here is, y'all work out y'all's salvation with fear and trembling. It's the second person plural, you all, rather than the singular, just you, as in just me. That means that our salvation and our faith is something that is carried out in community. It's not done in isolation. It's not, just poor Brian huddled under the bedsheets, afraid of God and wondering where he's going to go when he dies. By working out my salvation, it's me gathering with the whole community of believers and all of us together working to do good in the world, working to learn more about our God, working to become more faithful people who bear witness to Christ in our lives. And that's encouraging to me because it means that salvation does not depend on any individual one person. It's not up to me. But God is already working in our community. And God is enabling our community to keep working, to keep being faithful, to keep doing the good things that God has in store for us. And throughout Paul's letters, frequently when he uses that word you, it's really that word y'all. Paul doesn't have this vision of Christianity as only a personal relationship between me and Jesus, though I'd always encourage people to have a personal relationship with Jesus. Paul instead is thinking bigger, as we should think bigger, about our communities. Because Jesus doesn't just want a relationship with you or with me. He wants a relationship with both of us, with all of us. And that means that all of us matter and our whole community matters. It's why Paul is circling also this question of unity, that we need to come together and be a healthy, vibrant community. Because that's the way that we can be faithful. And that's the way that we work after salvation. That's then what he turns to in verse 14, where he warns them, do all things without murmuring and arguing, which I think is a verse that I certainly need to remember more often. And Paul wants us to be good examples in the world. He kind of paints this contrast that, the Christian community should be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish, that's us, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation in which you shine like stars in the world. I love that image, that we shine like stars in the world. And, Paul's condemnation of the culture in that time could be really severe because there were a lot of problems in that culture that really challenged the tenets of the gospel. Things that made it hard for people to live and to love one another, to thrive, and often even to survive. And that's true in our culture as well. So there's a challenge to us to not buy into the voices and the teachings and the attitudes of our culture that are opposed to the gospel. Rather, we want to shine forth as an example of another way, a better way. To bear witness to the fact that we don't need to listen to the voices of profit or of death or of individual selfishness. We follow instead the voice of Christ, which calls us upward. And this is why imitating Christ is such a powerful, ethical way of living. Because often in Paul's time and in our own, we advocate for this kind of prideful way of being, that I want to puff myself up. I want to make much of myself. I want to be the best. I want to be at the top. And Paul says, no, that way of being hurts us. The way of being that helps us is when we follow Jesus' example and we make little of ourselves to make much of others. And to the world that looks like foolishness, but to God it is beautiful. To God it looks like love. So With all that said in mind, Paul turns back to this question of, how do we make little of ourselves and make much of others? And it comes back in verses 16, 17, and 18. That Paul says, even if I am being poured out as a libation over the sacrifice and the offering of your faith, which is really grim sacrificial language of an altar. Paul, his time in prison, he's communicating that this is almost like death. Even if I am being poured out in this way, it's like Jesus is being poured out. And I can boast in you. I can be proud of you, my Christian family who loves me and who I love. And you all can be proud of me. So even when I am humbled, I'm really exalted, because you then are proud of me. And this is something that Paul will come back to often in his letters, that he wants to boast in the church. He doesn't want to brag about the things that he does as an individual. He finds pride in the Christian communities living out their vocation well. And that's true for us too. We think about, what do we boast in? Do I want to boast because, this is the best Bible study video that exists on YouTube, and, all my hours of study and, my startling presentation and this great backdrop that I have here is just the best Bible study you've ever seen? No. I'm excited about this Bible study because y'all are watching it. Because I can brag about the faith of this community that's come together even in a strange season to learn more about God. And that's something that excites me, and that's something that I want to brag about. I brag about y'all, that I am just blessed to be in such a wonderful church community. So for us, as we think about, what do we boast in? How are we witnesses in the world? How are we working out our faith? Our going further question that I want to leave you with in the second section of chapter 2 is, what work have you done on your faith lately? And the good news is that if you're watching this video, you're already covered, right? Because you are participating in this Bible study, you are learning more about God. This is work that you are doing on your faith. Congratulations. You already have your answer. But think about the other things too. And not all the work that we do on our faith looks like Bible study. Sometimes it looks like a prayer practice and learning to pray more. And other times, working on our faith can be something really mundane or simple, or something we wouldn't even think about. Going to church regularly, that's a really good one. And, one of our vestry members shared that he was just so excited about virtual church because it made it really easy to keep up his church attendance streak. You can make it every week because it's just from your couch and your pajamas. But I think there are other ways we work on our faith too. Sometimes it's kicking bad habits. Sometimes it can be just cultivating an attitude of thankfulness or an attitude of wonder. Literally stopping to smell the flowers from time to time and paying attention to the natural world around us. I think when we do that intentionally, that can be a moment when we are working on our faith. So take a few moments now and think about that question for yourself. How am I working on my faith in this time? And I guarantee you all have something to answer. This isn't the priest trying to make you feel bad or guilty. But if you're struggling to come up with something, or you want to really go further, what's some more work that you could do on your faith? What is something that you want to be working on to grow in your knowledge and love of God and your ability to love God's people? So take a few moments and think about that now. So turning now to the third section of chapter 2, I'm looking here at verses 19 through 30. We get into some of the social and historical context behind Paul's letter to the Philippians. Father David talked about this in the introductory video, so I'll kind of give a summary overview. At one point in time, Paul had traveled through Philippi with Timothy, who was kind of his sidekick, his coworker in the gospel. And they'd spent some time with the church there, and then Paul had gone off. And at this point in time, Paul is imprisoned in Ephesus. And the church of Philippi, remembering Paul's visit with Timothy, wanted to support him. So they sent one of their number, Epaphroditus, with some money and some resources to help support Paul when he was locked in prison. And while Epaphroditus was there, he fell sick, and it didn't look good, but he got better. And now that he's recovered, Paul is sending him back to Philippi with the letter to the Philippians, which is really a thank you letter. So at this point in the letter, Paul is sort of explaining what he's doing. He says, I long to send you Timothy because Timothy is this wonderful minister and I have so much confidence in him. But I can't send him just yet, though I know y'all love him and you want to see him again soon. But I've sent back Epaphroditus, and I want to commend him to you, that he has done some really good work for the gospel, and he's cared for me, and has shared so much of your love with me. And y'all should be proud of him and welcome him back as someone who risked his own life for God's work. And that's sort of what the picture that Paul paints here, just the narrative effect of what's going on. But what we see here, and what I love about these parts in Paul's letter, is how human they are. And they give us a window into just what life looked like in those early church communities. That kind of this local hometown hero, Epaphroditus, was the one to bring aid to Paul and to care for him. And now he returns home having risked his life, and, is probably coming back to hugs and cheers, and his church family is just so excited that he's home, and that he has this letter from Paul that he can share with them all. And it's important for us to realize here, too, that Paul, though most of the letters we have in the New Testament come from Paul, he's not the only one doing this kind of work in the churches. He's a celebrity to us because we have all these letters, and certainly he was a celebrity to the early church as well. But there were a ton of faithful ministers working behind the scenes to help Paul in his mission. And Paul frequently talks about his co-workers in the gospel. Timothy is one of them, and so too now is Epaphroditus. These were people who would travel around to encourage and support the early church, to challenge heresies or teachings that were contrary to the gospel of Christ. And it reminds us that faith is not worked out by, one celebrity pastor who we hitch our horse to. Faith is something that all of us do together. And even, the greatest Christian leaders need a lot of help and a lot of support from the people around them. Paul couldn't have done it without the support of the church in Ephesus. And Paul couldn't have done it without the support of people like Timothy or Epaphroditus. So it's important for us to remember, and this, it all kind of comes full circle here. Our faith is a communal thing. It's not just Paul's faith, but the faith of all the churches. And that for us to share in this communal faith, it's important that we remain united, that we follow the example Christ has set for us, that we try to keep the same mind with one another, and that we really keep an eye out towards supporting one another, especially when people are in need. So for the final going further question today, I think you should ask yourself, who is your coworker in the gospel? Who is somebody that you would trust to send in your place? Who is somebody that encourages you, or supports you, or challenges you, or even convicts you when you need it? Who is someone that strengthens your life of faith? And that's a big question. You may not have anyone who comes to mind. And what I encourage you to do then is think about who you might ask. Who is somebody that could be your co-worker in the gospel? Maybe it's a family member. Maybe it's a parent. Maybe it's a spouse or a sibling. Maybe it's somebody in church, someone that you sit next to every week, or another friend who you're close to. And, you don't have to go around and ask, will you be my co-worker in the gospel? I don't think Episcopalians really respond too well to those kinds of invitations. But I encourage you to cultivate that kind of relationship What are the friendships that you can build with people who really support you, who really lift you up in your faith, someone who you could really trust to send in your place? Look out for those people and try to cultivate those relationships. And it requires being vulnerable. And sometimes it requires work. And especially in the season of social distance, we're all scratching our heads trying to figure out how to be a community and how to grow closer together even when we're trying to stay far apart. But that just means it's all that much more important to think about that kind of question right now. What are those kinds of relationships we have that really matter? Those people who really support and encourage and challenge and convict us. Who is your coworker in the gospel? Thanks for joining me today for our second session of Philippians. We've made it through chapter 2, and I'm so glad that you joined me for that. I encourage you to spend some time with those going further questions and reflecting on what Paul has written to this church in Philippi can really help us find some direction as we work out our own faith with fear and trembling even today. And we'll see you next week as Father David carries us on into chapter 3. Peace be with you all, and we'll see you soon.